No, Fraser, Fontaine, and Kong is a household name and really requires no, what should I say, no introduction. We've probably all done business with them in some way, shape, or form over the years. And, and it's been quite a while because I gather they are celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. Congratulations to them. They must be doing something right. Now, Fraser, Fontaine and Kong, FFK, has partnered with Beazley Insurance Group to bring cyber insurance to Jamaica. We're very excited about it. So it's with a pleasure that I introduce our final presenter, Mr. Najib Bousakr. I'm so sorry.
That's correct. That's correct.
Bousakr, right? Mr. Bousakr is the regional head of Latin America and the Caribbean for the Beazley Insurance Group. Najib has 2 decades of experience in insurance with a focus on cyber, crime, and directors and officers insurance. He has made his mark across the world, having worked in leading insurance companies in the UK and Brazil, eventually joining the Beazley Insurance Group in 2017. And for those of you who don't know, Beazley is one of the leading syndicates in Lloyd's. That's the largest and oldest insurance market in the world. So we definitely have a cyber insurance expert amongst us this morning. And we're very happy to have him here. Najib, I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Thank you, everyone, for being present. So without further ado, let's discuss the cyber risk from an insurance perspective. So for the next half an hour or so, I would like to give you an overview of the ever-changing world of cyber risk and how we insurers are adapting to face this risk, all whilst continuing to provide you with the best insurance solutions. Next slide. I don't know so a little bit about Beazley. So we were established in 1982 as a Lloyd syndicate, as Anne-Marie said. We have since grown to become an insurance company. We have expanded the clients base that we serve and our geographic reach. We are now a mature insurance business with a well-diversified portfolio. That being said, more than 60% of our revenue come from cyber and executive risk business. So unlike other insurance companies, we're very much focused on cyber, and we make it part of our strategy. The US was the predominant market for us up until recently, but since 2017, we have opened office in Singapore, in Barcelona, Paris, and in Miami to serve the Latin America and the Caribbean market. Next slide. So Beazley, the cyber team at Beazley has been around since 2009. We were one of the first cyber markets. We had tremendous growth since the beginning, obviously, with all, with cyber becoming such a topical issue. We have teams all over the US and outside the US, and we are the pioneers in what we call breach response. So going back to 2009, our clients had access to vendors under their policies, but they needed to help. They needed help to coordinate their response. So this is where Beazley breach response came in. We have ample experience on large, medium, and small risks. And from our perspective, suffering a cyber incident isn't really a disaster, but mishandling it is. So we'd really like to be there from the beginning, from the moment the breach occurs. We spent more than 80% of our claims spent on services and managing incidents. And we have managed, since 2012, we have managed 6 out of the top 10 incidents in the world, the largest incidents. And we have a database of 16,000 global breach incidents globally. Next slide. So this is our partnership with Fraser, Fontaine, and Kong. I think, Anne-Marie, you touched on that. We can continue to the following slide. So cyber risk is on the rise, as we've seen from the 2 previous presentations, in both frequency and impact. The threat is varied and adaptable. Hackers and criminals always end up adapting to new protection and security measures implemented and always find ways to overcome it. And the acceleration of the digital transformation with the pandemic has, the increase of home working, the whole boom of cryptocurrency, the fintechs, the competing with traditional banks, all of these contribute to high web traffic, which means high risk of data breach or intrusion. I think this file is quite representative of the impact that the GDPR had since its implementation. So this is an example in the United Kingdom. So the fines used to range between the 100,000 and 500,000 British pounds before GDPR. And since implementation of GDPR, we've seen fines in the millions. In this case, I used the most extreme one, which is British Airways, which was 183 million pounds in fine. Next slide. So next one, please. So why is cyber insurance needed? I think that's probably the first question you would ask. You know, we discussed earlier that there is an issue with employee negligence. You know, so employees tend to be very negligent, especially when there's a lack of awareness and lack of training of employees. There's also a risk from the own company's negligence. So when they forgot to encrypt, when they don't have a corporate security officer. There's also malicious acts such as, you know, fraud and theft, you know, disenfranchised employees. So, and then, you know, there are the external risks. So for example, the hackers looking to introduce a malicious software or disrupting the company's services, the phishing, which we've heard of so often these days, fraudulent practice of sending emails purporting to be from a reputable company in order to induce individuals to reveal personal information and confidential information. There's also the social engineering element, which is the use of deception to manipulate individuals into disclosing confidential information. And there's also another element which we often forget about, which is the lack of security at the providers and the commercial partners that you're dealing with, which could affect your own security and cause breach within your systems. I think we can go through this slide. We can skip through the slide. I'm conscious of time. So costs incurred by a cyber event. So, you know, the pecuniary loss of a customer affected by the breach. So question you ask yourself is, how many losses will this customer suffer? What's the impact of the data breach on your own customer? The loss to the assured, to yourself as a company. So your notification costs, the lawsuits you have to pay, the audits you have to go through, the reputation costs, the downtime that caused in your company, the business interruption element, how long it will take you to remediate the attack and resume normal operation, and how much potential revenue will you lose in this downtime. And finally, the fines and penalties, which, as we saw, are getting bigger and bigger, especially now with the Data Protection Act being implemented. Next slide. So at Beazley, we cover all these costs. So we cover the fees and costs of legal services. So you're getting your lawyers involved in identifying the breach or in handling the customer complaint. We cover the forensic services to determine the cause of a breach, try to stop it or make it or preventing it from becoming bigger. Notification services in some countries, and I think it will be most likely follow in Jamaica. There is an obligation to notify every customer whose data has been compromised. So the assured will have to set up a structure in place, such as a call center, you know, to call every customer and notify them of the breach. There is also all the credit and monitoring services. So if the data of your customer have been compromised, you need to monitor the credit and identity for a certain period of time after the breach to make sure that it's not being used for fraudulent purposes. And finally, there is the PR and crisis management costs. So when your company is affected by an event like this and it's leaked to the press and everyone hears about it, then you're very likely to suffer from reputational damage, and you need public relation officers, agents, to kind of help you reestablish your reputation. So all of this will be covered also under a cyber policy. Next slide. So the cyber policy is made of two sections. In general, we divide it in a section which is about third-party liability, so the damage caused to third parties, and your own loss as a company, so your first party loss. The third party liability covers the data breach, so the theft, loss, and disclosure of sensitive information. A security breach, so a failure to prevent unauthorized access, or a denial of service, or an infection in your computers that that spreads a malicious code, or any failure to disclose a breach to any regulator. So that would also be covered under the policy. Also covered are the regulatory and defense penalties. So the fines that you may incur following a data breach, and also all the PCI DSS fines. So when you deal with the main credit card providers such as Visa and MasterCard, then you have to follow the standards of the PCI, which are mandated by the card brands. So if you breach them following any cyber event, then we will cover your costs. And finally, the media liability, that's also in the third party liability. So if there is, increasingly all companies now are on social media, advertising on LinkedIn, on other means of communication. So if there is a defamation or a libel or a slander or an infringement of copyrights or plagiarism, this will also be covered by our policy. And the first party loss is the second section. So we're talking about business interruption, the downtime that we mentioned earlier, dependent business interruption loss. So if you sustain a loss as a result of a breach, which will then put your provider system out of access, so then this will be covered. The cyber extortion, which we talked about, so it's a result of an extortion threat. So we will spend more time on that later because this is mainly becoming the highest risk. And finally, the data recovery costs. So any costs you incur in trying to replace your data or recover it or regain access to it. So next slide. So why do we need cyber insurance? So the number of incidents is so high. Someone mentioned earlier, it's no longer a question of if, it's a question of when. So this is a survey that was conducted in the United States about how, according to industries. So you would notice, for example, that 75% of hospitality clients who were surveyed suffered from hack or malware at some stage in their life. 53% in the retail industry. In the healthcare industry, 39% suffered from unintended disclosure. So it is really affecting all sectors, all industries, all services across the world. And what we're seeing, as I deal with Latin America and the Caribbean, before the common idea was this is very much of a US issue because the US is so litigious. It is no longer the case. We are now seeing huge hacks being operated on large Latin American and Caribbean companies as well. Next slide. So what do we need to assess your cyber risk? So first of all, we need the name, your name, and the activities that you operate and all the subsidiaries that operate under your name. We need all the web domains used to operate your business. So someone earlier mentioned an ethical hacking test. We actually do not carry out the ethical hacking, but we test all the domains for open ports. So if there's an RDC or an RDP or a Samba, so we tell you, okay, you need to close these ports because they're vulnerable to attacks. So we do this before we actually submit a quotation for your insurance. We also ask you for a ransomware questionnaire, which looks at issues such as the multi-factor authentication, whether or not you conduct phishing training to your staff, whether you have backups, if they're encrypted, and if they're stored in remote locations. So all of these issues were mentioned briefly earlier. And the way we work is we have like a traffic light scoring. So we work on green, amber, and red. So if we are satisfied with the answers, then it's a green, then your premium will be much cheaper than if we have like a red indicator. So the better the security, then the cheaper the premium, basically. So a bit of focus on ransomware. So we mentioned earlier, so ransomware is really at the moment a malware that typically enables cyber extortion for financial gains. criminal can hide links seemingly in normal emails or web pages, and once activated, it prevents users from having access to their files or applications. And obviously, they ask for a payment. Usually, it's in the form of cryptocurrency. The ransomware is a serious, growing cyber threat, affects people, and had made headlines for broader attacks on businesses. And as we said earlier, the growth of home working due to the pandemic contributed to an exponential increase in ransomware attacks. Next slide. So this is an example of a very well-publicized case of ransomware. Travelex in the UK, which is a money exchange travel agent, suffered a 4.6 million ransom demand that they didn't want to pay. And this occurred to a VPN that was vulnerable and that was reported to Travelex prior to the incident, but however, they did not patch on time. So again, this shows the importance of patching. And in the next slides, if we can pass this one. So this is, for example, the typical ransomware threat that you get in your email. So, we recommend that you start gathering money to pay us, or we'll sell your information to a relevant party. We see in the following slide also, we see some other examples. The next one, please. So this is also the type of threat that you get. We know who you are. You have that much in assets. We know how much you're worth. We have your information. If you don't pay, then we'll compromise your information. We'll prevent you from having access to the information, or we will filter it on the dark web, for malicious use. So, what we observe from ransomware agents, operators right now, is that they have greater visibility into the networks. They do more homework into their victims. Their attacks are more and more sophisticated. And what we saw earlier, there are new threats, such as what we call the doxing, which is the threat to reveal the data on the dark web if you don't pay up. What we also see, which is a very worrying trend, is a rise in attacks against managed service providers. So this can bring down multiple clients at the time. So the attacks happen on the MSP and its customers, which then has access to all the data of all the companies dealing with the MSP. So, and the hackers try to attempt to persuade the MSP to pay up, which will then become, which will have, implication on all its own clients. Next slide, please. So the question is, do we cover ransomware under an insurance policy? Yes, we do. So how? So if it's actually the actual ransom payment in Bitcoin, this is covered under the section cyber extortion. If it's a forensic investigation following the ransomware attack to determine the cause and try to stop it, then this would be covered under the data and network liability section. The cost to restore data would be covered under the data recovery costs. The loss of business due to downtime, this is the business interruption. The response to regulatory inquiries would be under regulatory proceedings and fines. And finally, the individual complaints from the third parties is also covered under the data and network liability. So we provide full cover for ransomware. What we have noticed is, with the increase in number of ransomware attacks, a lot of insurers are now limiting the cover, or they are simply refusing to give it. At Beazley, we are still keen to work with the clients to provide this cover as long as we get the information required. We are convinced that the client's website doesn't have any vulnerabilities, and we are satisfied with all the requirements, of multi-factor authentication and other security measures. So a little bit about the claims trend. I think, we talked a lot about claims, but I thought I would give you some examples. This is the loss of portable device that was non-encrypted. So, I think this was publicized. It was lost on the subway, on the tube in London, and it had backup tapes containing the information of 1.6 million customers, including their names, their social security numbers, their financial information, and it includes the data of 200,000 employees and suppliers. So the insured needed to obtain the legal and forensic crisis management service, the call center, and the mail provider, and the credit control necessary to respond to the incident. So this is where Beazley stepped in and helped them in implementing all these requirements. Another example, if we can go to the next slide, please. So this one is the loss of health data. So 20,000 pediatric patients had their data compromised following a phishing attack. So the employee clicked on the phishing email and gave away their credential, which then launched a malware onto their network. So you know, the data contained patient names, clinical information, phone numbers. Healthcare data tends to be extremely sensitive as well. So we see a lot of attacks on health providers and hospitals, for example. Next slide. So this one is an interesting one. This is a timeline of all the huge, or the large kind of cyber breach events that took place. So it started in 2007 with the TJX. You know, that it announced that more than 45 million credit and debit cards had been stolen from its IT database, and it went on. For example, if we jump to 2013, Yahoo had a huge data breach, you know, which for 3 billion users, and they were fined $35 million. That at the time was a record fine. If we continue to the next slide, you know, all these, I'm sure you've heard about the Equifax data breach in 2017, which was one of the largest cyber crimes related to identity theft. And that also implemented the setting up of, you know, a call center, credit and monitoring operations, which were you know, quite costly for the insurers. 2018 was the Marriott data breach. The Marriott was fined 23 million by the UK Information Commissioner Office. In 2020, there was, you know, the famous attacks on Microsoft, and there was the California Consumer Privacy Act, which goes into effect, which will also mean additional fines for data breach for the US customers. And finally, in 2021, there was the final the famous Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, which you know, disrupted for a very short period the distribution of oil and gas into some US states. And also there was the 11 million ransomware by JBS, which was mentioned earlier. JBS is a Brazilian meat company whose systems were completely paralyzed by Revil, the Russian ransomware operators, and they had to pay a record 11 million in fine. So on to the next slide. So this is the number of cases we've been handling. So, you know, as we said, there was a general increase in severity and frequency of insured and uninsured losses. And also, you know, every year we see an increase in the number of incidents. So as of 2020, we passed that figure. We're at 4,500. And in 2021, we've already handled, year to date, we've already handled more incidents than for the full 2020. If we go to the next slide. So I thought this would be an interesting one. So this basically outlines the number of, you know, the ransom, so the claims, cyber claims that are classified by type. So as you will see, it's the ransomware that is the main one with 34% of the cases. So, you know, this tells you, you know, that this is really a trend that we have to deal with going forward. The unintended disclosure and, you know, the business interruption are still happening. They're still taking place, but the ransomware is really now the dominant reason of, you know, cyber claims under an insurance policy. So what does this mean? If we can go to the next slide. So, you know, from your perspective as a client who is seeking cyber insurance, you know, engage early with your broker and with Beazley. Please understand the requirements for additional information. Why we're asking you for additional information. I think there is a general trend, the general belief that, just by filling a 3-page proposal form, we are able to give you a price and insure you. I think when it comes to cyber, we need to have a more thorough work, more, underwriting the risk, and we may have a lot of back and forth in asking you additional questions. Beazley is committed to cyber insurance. It remains one of our growth pillars for strategy. But also please understand that this is not just an insurance policy. We're not just indemnifying, but we're also offering you a tool to assist you in managing and reducing your cyber exposure. So all this back and forth that takes place before we actually indicate a price for your insurance is, in a way, helping you to reduce your exposure to any potential cyber incident. I think that was my last slide.
Yes, yes. Thank you so very much, Najib. I can see you guys have a comprehensive solution for cyber insurance, and there's so much to be done in there. I do remember you saying to me, and I don't remember you mentioning it to this morning, but you cover ransomware, and not all insurance companies cover ransomware. Is that correct?
Yes, I did mention earlier, a lot of insurance companies are actually withdrawing from the cover. They are, because there's so many incidents, as we saw earlier, because it's happening on such a regular basis. A lot of them are saying we can no longer cover it. A lot of them are sublimiting the ransomware coverage to very small sublimits. And what we're seeing increasingly now with some of our peers is that they're asking the client to co-insure. So whenever there's a ransomware case, our peers, our competitors will only offer to pay, say, 50% of the final loss. We don't do that. We, as long as we are satisfied with the security measures and we receive satisfactory information to all the elements that we've asked, we commit to give full ransomware coverage.
Right. So your first stop is info exchange, get your security done, then you move on to you get your premiums reduced and full coverage.
Exactly. Exactly.
All righty. We do have one question for you. It says here, how can a $50 million ransom be paid out in cryptocurrency and not be traceable to the beneficiary?
Oh, I mean, some of these ransomware payments were traced. So the solar wind one, which affected the US government, they managed to trace them and recover them. But I think, the whole point of cryptocurrency payment is that they're untraceable and they're deregulated. So, I think that's the reason why all the hackers and the hacktivists ask for payments in cryptocurrency.
Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions here specifically for Najib. You did such a spectacular job, Najib. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Okay. This question is on cyber insurance. I think Najib probably answered this already. It says, are we really protected with regards to total coverage and venue of your customer base? What are your thoughts on cyber insurance? Are you really protected with regards to total coverage and venue of your customer base?
I mean, yeah, I mean, as you're never completely protected, but the idea is that we make the policy evolve to adapt to the latest trends in cyber crimes and to adapt to the latest regulations imposed in terms of, data protection acts. But, I cannot sit here and commit to 100% protection,
Yeah.
There are always some exclusions with the retroactive date. It depends on when the event occurs, So, I'm happy to explain some of the exclusions, but in general, our aim is to give the best coverage.
Right. There's a question here from Debbie. I hope Debbie is still around. She says, referring to Najib, who said he's providing security for companies. How are they able to do that in order to offer us the service?
Security for companies. No, what we actually do is we test the website for vulnerabilities. It's So, you know, we just determine some of the open ports. Again, you know, it has its advantages, but it's also, you know, as Andel was saying, it's, you know, it gives you a picture at one point in time. It doesn't mean it's going to be that way the following day, but at least it gives us an idea of, you know, how many ports are vulnerable, and, you know, we could determine our risk for getting an extortion, a ransomware attack. So that's the kind of, you know, security we provide. The other is we ask, you know, we have a ransomware questionnaire that we ask the client to fill in. And, you know, if some of the answers are negative, we tell them, such as, you know, one of the most important one is the MFA, multi-factor authentication. We ask them to implement it. So this is the kind of security we give.
Yeah. One thing to remember, everyone, is that your security posture is really the sum of a number of things across a number of areas, across all of the possible vulnerabilities. So it's not any one particular thing. Somebody had asked about, you know, penetration tests. I mean, again, it's a point in time, and that gets stale every day after the test is completed. So it's really a sum of the areas that we've been talking about, and as Ondel has mentioned, to provide that level.
And a continuous monitoring.
Precisely, yeah. There was one thing quickly as well that I had mentioned earlier about putting data in the cloud and privacy and so on. There's one thing that I wanted to mention, which the fine print of the cloud provider's contract with you is this thing they call the shared responsibility model, where the provider is responsible for the uptime of the infrastructure, where you, Mr. Customer, you're responsible for securing the data that you put in there. So it's not a matter of hand it over to them and then that's it. Those data security measures that you have for your on-premises data also apply there in the cloud. So it's not set it and forget it over there. Just wanted to add that.
That's a good point, David, actually.
Here's an interesting one. What Michael wants to know, what would you say to companies planning to use insurance to cover for their lack of compliance with the DPA? There's somebody who's thinking.
Oh, there, Mike.
I'd love to know who asked that.
That's what I call a Dushra.
Robert, you want to take that?
No, I'm not touching that one with that 20-foot pole. I'm going to hand that one off. I'm strategically going to hand that one off to Najib. I'm not touching that one.
I think if you start telling an insurer that, you know, you're concerned about not being compliant with DPA, then it's a bad starting point for us because you're not taking your risk too seriously. So, yeah, I don't think it would be very attractive for us to protect this client.